So philosophical history. What is the history not just of events, but of ideas that come into particularly the background of American history, American political thought, American government, and the government of the United States? How did we get to where we are today in terms of our thinking and ideas? And our thinking and ideas actually have a long tradition that in some cases different themes go back hundreds, in some cases even over thousands of years to bring us to where we are today. Let's think through some basic questions. What is government? Dealt with that in another discussion, another video. But what is government? Not just what does it do, but what is the nature of the thing itself? What makes a government a government? What are some general things the government should do or provide, if you think it should do or provide certain things? What are some things government should be responsible for? What are its areas of authority or power or jurisdiction? Why do we think about government the way we do? Other people in other countries may think about government in different ways. We even, among ourselves, probably have differences of opinion about what the government is, what its role should be, what it ought to do, what it ought not to do. And so why do we think of it that way? Why do we come to have these certain ideas? Where does our philosophy of government come from? Everyone has a philosophy. Everyone has a philosophy of government. Now, the philosophy may not be something you consciously think of all the time. It may not even be something that you are aware of so much about thinking in your mind, but we all have a philosophy of government. What do we think government is? What do we think it should do and should not do, and why? And our goal ought to be a philosophy of government that is true and that is consistent, meaning it fits within our other ways of thinking correctly, and it's coherent. We can explain to others why we think about government the way we do. Why should we even have government at all? This is a related discussion. Is it necessary? And to what level is government necessary? If aliens from outer space were to land on this planet, having no knowledge of American politics, of the subject of political science, of government in general, how would you explain it to them? Imagine, or if we just want to keep things simple, imagine it's your job to explain to a 5-year-old what American government is, how it works. And maybe it's pluses and minuses, it's positives and negatives. What would you say? Where would you even start? Let's talk about forms of government. Plato, the philosopher, thousands of years ago, Greek philosophy, which is part of the underpinning of a lot of our modern thinking and even influences our language. He believed government was a cycle. He believed that there were cycles of government and that there were these positives and negative versions of government. And so he kind of put it into this sort of matrix that's come to be familiar in political discussion. And so it's ruled by, and it's kind of a number, and then it's the more general side of it or the positive side of it. And then the other side is more the negative or the self-interested side. So rule by one. This is called monarchy. It's, you think of king or a queen, single ruler. The positive of that is called monarchy. The negative would be called tyranny. Now, there may be some other names of it as well. And monarchy can be tyranny. So you don't want to get too stuck on the exact word. But he said the benevolent side, the good side would be the monarchy, the bad side would be the tyranny. What are the benefits to having one person rule? What are the negatives to having one person rule? We see in both sides the potential for maybe good and the potential for evil. Rule by a few. This is called aristocracy. Aristocrats, a few elites rule the society. Now, the general side, or the positive side, are aristocrats. These are supposed to be the best people, the most educated people, rule the government, and ideally make decisions on behalf of the people, on behalf of everyone, on the best of everyone, and that they would have some reason to make decisions that not only would benefit them, but would benefit others because they're concerned about their future holdings, their future prospects, whether their family line is going to continue and be in charge. So aristocracy, seen as the positive or the general side of this. The negative side is an oligarchy, a rule by a few. And if just a few elites, meaning kind of the top people of society, whether they're self-appointed or elected, you could imagine the negatives of just a few people ruling. The United States has somewhere around 315 million plus people. Many, many people. It's a large political state. Congress, the National Congress, which is meant to represent the people, has 435 representatives in the House of Representatives and 100 senators to represent the 50 states, 2 per each state. We have a president and we have a Supreme Court, but the Supreme Court's unelected. The president's elected every 4 years. Now, that's a very small amount of people to be representing 315 million people. Is it an aristocracy? Is it an oligarchy? Is it in some cases a monarchy or a potential even for a tyranny? If one person can make a unilateral decision by themselves. Rule by many, rule by all. This is everyone's favorite word in Western political thought. It is democracy, ruled by the demos, the people. The negative side of this often isn't heard or even discussed. It'll be discussed in a later lecture, later video. Is autocracy, or ochclocracy. There are a couple different ways of pronouncing it. Autocracy, I believe, is the most correct. It's the idea of mob rule. That a democracy, the positive benefits of it are that it has a fairness. It includes people. It allows people a say in their government. Okay, that's supposedly a good thing. However, with the votes that come with a democracy, there can be this constant revolution or overthrowing of stability. And if one majority of people decides to vote to enslave a minority of people, that can be democracy at work. People can vote to take away the rights of others in a democracy if the democracy is left unchecked. And some believed that it was kind of a cycle, that a monarchy would become a tyranny, eventually overthrown by an aristocracy, which would become an oligarchy, which would be overthrown by a democracy, which would become an autocracy, which eventually would be overthrown by a monarchy to reestablish order. And these are not exhaustive. These aren't all the possibilities of government, but they are some discussed, and they are common terms today. Which one is preferable? It has been said that democracy is the best option, or is the worst option, actually, except for everything else. In other words, it's not great, but it's the best we've got. Now, is that the truth? Is mob rule better than oligarchy? And do we have different aspects of these in American government? What about anarchy? Anarchy is not the movie The Purge, where all criminal activity is necessarily legal. That can be a form of anarchy. But anarchy is the idea of no political state with a monopoly on force, meaning they're the only ones who can use force and violence legally. Anarchy would be the idea of absence of government, not absence of law or rules necessarily, but the absence of a dictating force, whether it be in any of these forms. Now we have to think through some of these ideas, the history of some of these ideas, and cover a lot of historical time period and not really do justice to all of it. But part of our ideas come from the Renaissance. This famous painting represents Renaissance thinking. It was painted during the time of the Renaissance, which is obviously a wide period, 400 years. It was never acknowledged in that time as we're living in the Renaissance. It was recognized later as that. Now, Plato and Aristotle are here in the middle. Plato points upward, seeing kind of his more vertical philosophy. Aristotle points forward, his more horizontal philosophy of this world. And you can see there are differences there. Our thinking in the West, in Greece, Rome, the Western world are influenced by these. Eventually, Europe and the United States are very influenced by Greece, very influenced by Rome. You can even see this in some of the architecture of the buildings in places like Washington, D.C. They're very influenced by that and the thinking of Plato and some of his background thinking. And then also by Aristotle, who is a different philosopher in quality than Plato, and who really developed or put to words the ideas of logic and different ideas that we commonly use his categories when we discuss things. The Renaissance was a time of intense, all-encompassing, and in many ways distinctive philosophical activity. Changes in thinking that 1,000 years ago plus still influence us today. And by 1,000 years ago, I mean about 700 years ago, starting roughly in 1300, misspoke. The Reformation is also, and Western Christianity is also a major influence in Western and American political thought. The Reformation, of course, being a division of loosely called Christianity of Protestantism from the Church of Rome. And the Church of Rome was sometimes antagonistic with the political state, but they worked together. The Church of Rome was a government in its own respect, and then kings and princes and others were a government in another respect, making laws and different things. But there was not this idea of that you just had your religion and you did whatever you want, believed whatever you wanted. And then there was this government and laws. It's that for all of human history until fairly recently, these ideas were together. And you can actually see that these ideas are still together in many ways. And I'm not talking about the Christian right. I'm talking about, though that is an example, I'm talking about the way people view governments is in many ways religious. They view governments as a source of ultimate justice. They view governments for a source of making the world right. They view governments as a source of salvation in many cases. They view governments as a source of safety. Many of these things that people have historically gone to religion to find their hope in. Many people view government the same way, even if they're atheists, agnostics, claiming to believe in no God at all. Now, the Reformation is a breaking point in that system that causes a move toward independency. Although, if you lived in one area that was Protestant, it was illegal for you to be a Catholic. And if you lived in one area that was Catholic, it was illegal for you to be Protestant. Now, there were some exceptions, but this was a way of categorization of people that was the norm, that you were required to obey the religion of your prince, of your local area, your government. The Reformation, according to historian Philip Schaff, of the 16th century, next to the introduction of Christianity, is the greatest event in history. It marks the end of the Middle Ages and the beginning of modern times. Starting from religion, it gave directly or indirectly a mighty impulse to every forward movement and made Protestantism the chief propelling force in the history of civilization. So Protestantism has majorly influenced the governmental thinking of the United States. Catholicism as well, but to a large extent, Protestantism entered that modern age in a way that Roman Catholicism did not, and marked an end really to the Middle Ages and a beginning of the modern time. And it would have those consequences, both positive and negative, that would move forward and influence the thinking about government as well as religion. And we know Martin Luther, most likely from history, Martin Luther's protest against the Catholic Church. Now, his protest was not against the Catholic Church in and of itself initially. It was against the practices of the Roman Catholic Church, recalling it to what he saw as purity in doctrine, purity in religion. He viewed himself as part of the Roman Catholic Church, and it's only later he views the Roman Catholic Church as an apostate, a false representation of Christianity, and he makes a break from that. And that's when more Protestantism comes about later, actually after Martin Luther. Calvin. John Calvin later comes as one of the major writers, preachers of the Reformation, and he writes a book called The Institutes that is one of the most influential books in Western and Protestant Christianity, and even worldwide, and also helps develop ethics and political thought for that time that influence even through to today. It has been said, quote, "It has been said that to omit Calvin from the history of Western civilization is to read history with one eye shut." So if you do not know John Calvin, it's as if you are half blind to understanding what's really going on with this history of the 1500s forward, because you'd be missing a crucial piece. What are some of the priorities and responsibilities John Calvin saw for civil government? What did he think the government should be and do? So his goal was that the public quiet not be disturbed. The government should keep order. That every man's property be kept secure. So the government should protect property. That men carry on innocent commerce with one another. So the government should establish and maintain a consistency of laws in which people are able to freely trade with one another, as long as they are not stealing from each other through force or fraud, and that they are able to honestly interact with each other in a free and legitimate way. And his goal, go back here, he says that honesty and modesty be cultivated, meaning it's just the idea of, again, of keeping order. And he says, in short, that a public form of religion may exist among Christians and humanity among men. So now his goal is that the government should maintain a system that protects his understanding of true doctrinal Christianity, meaning you could not be an atheist, you could not be involved in the Church of Rome, you could not be a Jew, all these different things. Not that you couldn't exist necessarily within this sphere, but that it was not the freedom of religion or freedom of worship that we associate with Americanism mainly. That the form of public religion may exist among Christians and humanity among men. So this idea of natural rights in which humans are ordered and hemmed in by government in order to protect natural rights. It says in states, the thing next in importance to the magistrates is laws, the strongest sinews of government. So he has this idea of the magistrates. These are the people in charge, but also held responsible before God for their rule. So they could be removed if they were not seen as obeying God, was part of the thought. Or they could be disobeyed if they were thought to be at odds with the rule of God. And he also has a strong view of rule of law. Now, this doesn't mean necessarily that he just said, okay, let's take the Old Testament or the Bible and apply that law to society. His idea of rule of law was more that different areas may have different laws, but they needed to be just and in line with what he saw as biblical Christianity that followed the Bible. Now, what form did Calvin believe that government should take? He discusses some of these. He talks about monarchy. He says monarchy is prone to tyranny. He says in an aristocracy, again, the tendency is not less to the faction of a few, while in popular ascendancy, there is the strongest tendency towards sedition. So he says, okay, here are the problems. Monarchy might become a tyranny. Aristocracy, they may just be interested in their own interests and use the government power to accomplish that. And in popular ascendancy, meaning like a democracy, that's the most prone to being overthrown by a revolution. He said it's better that several bear rule, meaning spreading out this government. So he favored more of a kind of a modified aristocracy. So his idea is that they'd mutually assist, instruct, admonish each other, and that these multiple rulers, a plurality of rulers would be better to balance things out. The Enlightenment. Now, the Enlightenment happens over a period of time, but this is the main area of thinking in which the United States government, the American way of thinking of government, is formed. Now, this is George Washington. This is Thomas Jefferson. This is James Madison. This is John Adams. This is the context. They are Enlightenment men. Now, the Enlightenment is a more of a movement to intellectual independence distinguished from Christianity. So it doesn't throw away Christianity in its practices or its morals, but it wants to reject the supernatural and authoritative aspects of Christianity and the Bible, and wants to focus simply on reason is their argumentation. Now, whether or not can you just have pure reason? In other words, where is reason coming from? How do we know that our reasoning is legitimate and correct? By what standard do we follow? But they believed in God. They believed in a creator, but they were more in line, and this is speaking very generally, because many of them did not believe this. Some were very much Christian, and some were not Christian at all, and everything in between. But it was this idea of forming by reason this ideal and limited form of government that would be the best for humanity. Okay. Now, the United States was formed during the time of the Enlightenment. The founders, as they're called, were influenced by modern Enlightenment thinking. Now, what is the Enlightenment? Enlightenment, there's this idea, it has the word light in it, to bring something to light. But here's a definition. Enlightenment is the process of undertaking to think for oneself, to employ and rely on one's own intellectual capacities in determining what to believe and how to act. Now, is that fully possible? Can we only think? Now, we always say it's good. Yeah, think for yourself. I want you to think for yourself, not just believe what everybody else tells you. However, there are limits to that, because all our thinking is not just from within our own mind. It can't just be, I think, therefore I am. That has some validity to it, but where does our thinking come from? Our thinking can just be described as chemical processes. And so how do we know that our thinking is right? We follow rules of logic and rationality and reason and things like that, but we also have disagreements, and even smart people have disagreements with one another. And so just thinking for yourself may not be sufficient. Immanuel Kant, an Enlightenment thinker, said enlightenment is man's emergence from his self-incurred immaturity, meaning it's this idea of now we're going to be intellectually mature. We're not going to listen to God. We're not going to listen to the Bible. We're not going to listen to these things. We're going to think for ourselves. But did their thinking, though they were geniuses in many cases, that's not debated, but did their thinking and their ideas rise to the level of curing society's problems, which many of them thought if they could just get a government that would be by reason and these different things, or education systems, that they could solve many of these issues. And Kant again says, have courage to use your own understanding. Now, the Enlightenment represented many divergent views. So even though everybody says, well, I'm just using my reason, we're just using reason, and truth doesn't contradict itself and all this, but that didn't mean that they all thought the same. It didn't mean that everybody had the same opinions, same ideas, same patterns and ways of thinking. The Enlightenment was also not evenly distributed over time and geography. So while the Enlightenment's happening in Europe, it's not having as an immediate influence on the United States. It's in pockets, and it's over time. The Enlightenment can be summed up in the desire for intellectual independence. Intellectual independence. It's that your own brain, your own mind, your own thinking is sufficient, is enough for you to enlighten yourself. That was the thinking, whether or not we decide to agree with that. But that is the thinking in which Americanism and American government, the United States political science, is influenced, as they were Enlightenment men, that their thinking was based in these ideas. What are some ways the Enlightenment contributed to American political thought? Well, you see the idea of independence. Well, as people start to think more independently and start to question governments and question why should these things be this way, you can see why a movement toward a more independent government might be in people's minds, whether or not that actually is accomplished, but especially in the revolution of an independence movement. For all the enduring accomplishments of Enlightenment political philosophy, it is not clear that human reason proves powerful enough to put a concrete, positive, authoritative ideal in place of the ideals negated by rational criticism. As in the epistemological domain, reason shows its power more convincingly in criticizing authorities than in establishing them. Now, here's the problem. Before, when there was an authority, the authority could tell people what to do. Now that everyone is their own authority in their own minds, and all claiming that we're all using reason, it's easier to criticize than to actually establish and say, this is right, this is just, this is right and wrong, this is what a law should be, this is what a government ought to do. And so that's one of the problems, is it's much easier to criticize than to establish truth. The Enlightenment is also known for its political accomplishments. It's marked by three major revolutions that established kind of the modern, or the basis for the modern constitutional democracies. The English Revolution, which is a bloodless revolution in England, in which Queen Mary and her husband, William of Orange, overthrew her father and reestablished themselves over the throne of England. And they remove her more Catholic-leaning father and establish it as a Protestant throne, then on into this very day. And this is a bloodless revolution, but it's also a more Republican revolution in the sense that it's the idea of moving more towards representation. The American Revolution. Now, this is the one with which we are most familiar most of the time, is a revolution more for liberty or independence. It is not the establishment of a government. That's a misunderstanding. The establishment of the US government comes about much later, or a number of years later. But the American Revolution is a liberty and independence revolution. It's a separation from the government of England for the goal of independent self-government of these 13 colonies, which will become the 13 original states of the United States. Now, the United States itself, there's not one government called the United States during this time. It is 13 separate governments fighting to separate themselves from the government of Britain. Now, the government of Britain at this time is also a constitutional republic. It's a government that has a constitution. And one of the issues of the American Revolution is they are accusing the king and the parliament of breaking the English Constitution, and they eventually decide to separate themselves. The French Revolution, which happens later, the French are of course allies to the Americans in the American Revolution against the British. The French establish a revolution of statist equality. That is equality forced by overthrowing the existing order and replacing it with an all-powerful political government. Now, this forcing of equality means the removal of all religion. Now, France had been a very Catholic, had a strong Catholic tradition, a strong Protestant tradition, strong historical traditions that have been around for thousands of years and centuries, that it had developed until this time. And all that is removed. And the French Revolution says we're going to kill off all of our leaders, reappoint these elites who are going to be the smartest people, the best people to run society, and we're going to force equality and get rid of all things from the traditions of the past and totally start over. The French Revolution, because of this, becomes very, very bloody. And a revolution, though we use the word equality quite often, and there are different meanings for that word, a revolution like the French Revolution for equality is going to have that problem of much bloodshed and struggle for power and a reestablishment of powers and constant revolution, because the establishment of equality by force means constant revolution, because there will always be unequal parties. There will be people in charge and people not in charge. There will be inequality in different forms. And so it necessitates, it demands a constant type of revolution. I'm going to end this particular video here and pick up next time to continue discussing the influence of the Enlightenment and these revolutions, and some particular political thinkers who influence who we might call the founders or the main thinkers of American political thought in the early stages.